Welcome to Meet the COO, Swati Reichmuth, our new career-oriented interview format by the Operations Council. My name is Neil Brown, CEO of the Operations Council. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists, Swati Reichmuth, COO/CFO of Rune Labs, a San Francisco-based precision neurology digital health startup. Swati's operations career began as a mechanical engineer at CISCO, then management consultant and chief of staff at Deloitte Consulting, San Francisco, followed by business operations at Samsung Digital Health, and then a rapid trajectory of funding and promotions at digital health startup BrightInsight. Swati earned a MBA-Strategy Operations at UC Berkeley and a BS Mechanical Engineering at UC Berkeley. She is an advisor in residence at Kicker Ventures and a member of the San Francisco chapter of CHIEF, an association of women executives. Swati, welcome and thanks for joining us today. Let's go on video.
Great. Thanks, Neil, for having me today.
Oh, yes, our pleasure. So before we get into our questions, would you please tell us a little bit about your current company and role?
Yeah, so currently Rune Labs, as you sort of mentioned there, we are a precision neurology digital health startup focused on harnessing brain data in order to better understand what is happening to patients with different neurological diseases outside of the doctor's office. And then using that information to inform clinical decisions, better patient outcomes, and then also pharma and medtech companies accelerate clinical trials or demonstrate real-world evidence for commercial therapies, so drugs and medical devices that are already out in the market. So our first use case actually is in Parkinson's. We've created a application on top of the Apple Watch that detects tremor and dyskinesia for patients with Parkinson's. So tremor and dyskinesia are one of the primary symptoms of Parkinson's. And Parkinson's, again, is a degenerative disease. There's no cure, but there are ways to help sort of manage the disease state and increase quality of life. And so a big part of that is, helping control the tremors. And so you can do that either through medication or implantables that can send different signals to parts of the brain to manage the tremor. And so what our device on the Apple Watch does, or our application on the Apple Watch, is actually track that tremor, and you can overlay that with different medications. When people with Parkinson's are taking their medications, you can overlay that with other data coming from the Apple Watch, such as, everything from HealthKit, and then get sort of a full view of what's happening with the patient against the medications or treatments that they are doing, right? So then again, that can help inform the patient, the clinician, and then also pharma companies and med device companies on how well treatments are working.
Wow, very, very interesting. So really, brain surgery here we're talking about there.
So the implantable there are a few different med device companies out there that do the implantable, and yes, once that is implanted, then we can look at how tremor and dyskinesia has changed over time after that implantable has been implanted.
All right, well, let's get to our questions. Our interview format's intended to get to a number of career-oriented questions. And my first is, how did you transition from engineering to operations?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, when I was in undergrad studying mechanical engineering, I enjoyed the subject, but I didn't love designing. And so my first job out of college was actually as a manufacturing engineer, which gave me a lot of exposure to process. It wasn't just how to build a product or design a product, I should say. It was actually how to build a product and bring it to fruition and to market. And so that in itself was probably, sort of early signs of, someone who is interested not just in sort of designing something, which is wonderful in itself, but actually sort of being on the ground, looking at how, the gears turn. And then as I was in my career working as a manufacturing engineer, early days at CISCO, what I realized is I really enjoyed working with people, leading teams, pulling together plans, driving execution. And so then I started to make the shift into program management. I started to seek out more program management type of roles at CISCO. And was fortunate enough to find those actually within manufacturing initially. And again, for me, that was really all about not just like, designing and then building, but actually, taking it to a point where you can bring it to customers. And so I think, as I think about sort of the shift to operations, it was that as I was in program management, I just took on larger and larger initiatives or projects. So, my first project was focused on maybe 1 or 2 products. And then I started looking at projects and leading projects that were leading change across the entire company. So at that time, we were outsourcing a lot of manufacturing, and I led the efforts to outsource the last like high mix, low volume product that CISCO was initially manufacturing in-house to our contract manufacturer. And I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed sort of taking on these bigger projects. And so I'd say that was probably the first transition into operations. And then the second one was this chief of staff role that I started to play as I went into my management consulting career. And I think that took the program management to another level, because then it wasn't just about large initiatives, but it was looking at I was chief of staff to the managing director for all the San Francisco Bay Area consulting practices. And there it was looking at like every practice, how they were working together, how we were building the brand. And so it was taking, sort of my program management skills, and accumulating them at sort of this like, company level, if you will, which in our case was, the San Francisco Bay Area consulting practice. And so, I think those 2 shifts, I would say, were, sort of key to my transition into more of an what would eventually be a global and company level operations role.
Neat. Well, I can't wait to hear what you say about the next one. What are the roles and responsibilities of a combined COO, CFO, and how does that differ from a traditional COO role?
Yeah, I think, when I think about traditional roles, and I've looked at actually some of your previous Meet the COO interview series, which have been wonderful. I think, even at the time that I started my career, like operations was much more physical operations. I mentioned too, I worked, as a manufacturing engineer. I was on the manufacturing floor watching, hardware be built. And I think a lot of the traditional roles are focused, even as a CFO or COO, on more of the physical operations. I would say, and so, on the COO side, it's like sort of what sort of infrastructure do you need, but that's more physical infrastructure, like plants and equipment. And then of course, then on the finance side, it's like, how do you capitalize that? How do you depreciate that? As we move into SaaS, which is the world that I live in, software as a service, it's really all about less about the physical infrastructure and really more about the people, the strategy, the execution. The hardware component sort of comes in the underlying infrastructure you need to build your software on top of. But I would say in the context of startups, where the name of the game is like building, hyper growth, building fast, it really becomes all about really understanding all the different parts of the business. So everything from engineering and product down to delivery and operations, and then everything, from like the people, finance, legal, all the core infrastructure that is required to build the product and bring it to market. And so I think, I feel like in my role today, that combined COO, CFO role is, less about operations or finance and just much more about strategy almost. What's the operation strategy? What's the finance strategy? And so a big part of what I've been doing, at least at Rune for the last year, is establishing the financial strategy, which in startups and today is really about, profitability and runway. So establishing that strategy and then defining like the rest of the company level strategy built on that financial strategy.
And are you seeking funding and that kind of thing as well, like you've done in other earlier roles?
Yeah, so same thing. That's, yeah, definitely. We are in the process. It's sort of an ongoing thing, but when you fundraise, you maybe take a break for like 6 months and then, you're sort of out in the world fundraising again. And so our CEO is definitely sort of actively doing that. And then, you know, in that context, then I play a heavy role in terms of building a lot of the financial models that support what we go to market or what we go out with in terms of fundraising.
Got it. Very interesting. All right, let's look at our next question. What have been some of the milestones or inflection points in your career?
Yeah, you know, actually, I think we covered some of it in question one, but I definitely feel like that switch to program management was one. And you know, when you're an engineer, it's hard to, it's not hard in the sense that, you know, skill set wise, but, you know, a lot of engineers follow like the more traditional path of designing products. And so I was sort of forging a different path. And so, you know, I spent a lot of time actually, given that CISCO was a big company, talking to, just doing a bunch of like informational interviews for like 3 or 4 months, like learning about different parts of CISCO and talking to different managers. So I think that move definitely into program management was a big one, because again, program management, big part of program management is as you get to bigger projects is sometimes, you know, really being able to influence without necessarily always having direct reports. And so I think that just the ability to like lead and influence was like a core sort of skill set I learned through that transition. So that was definitely one. I think I switched into management consulting. So I went into management consulting at Deloitte after business school, and I think that was another big milestone / inflection point. Primarily, like the biggest thing you learn in consulting, it's probably 2 or 3 key ones, I would say actually. One is how to distill lots of information down into something digestible. So one of my mottos is like operating within organized chaos, which is really important, I think, for startups. And the way you do that, or the way I do that, is building a framework. Anytime there's a big problem, right? Once I amass a lot of information, I'm like, okay, let me categorize it into like 3 categories and really figure out, like, of all the stuff that I've learned, where does it fit into those 3? Right? It becomes much more digestible and understandable. And then you can start creating detailed plans in each one of those. At least there's the top 3 things that you're going after. And so I think management consulting was a great training ground for building those frameworks and then building them almost with simplicity, meaning, again, you can build a ton of the details underneath, but as you're talking about it, presenting it, right? Presenting it in such a way that you communicate, sort of up level it and communicate it in a way that people understand and can rally around it. And so I'd say that foundation, I think, is key to how I operate today. And then the third one, which we also covered in question one, was the chief of staff, because I think that just gave me really good insight into, you know, if you want to help run a company, like what are the things you have to think about? And it's really looking not just at each individual initiative or project, but how are they all coming together? And then how do you work with other leaders to prioritize? How do you influence other leaders to do things, you know, where you're looking at it for the good of the whole and not just each individual initiative?
Wow, great information. Tell us about some of the most significant keys to your success.
Yeah, I think I thought about this one for a little bit. There's probably 2 things. One is that I would say pretty resilient and resourceful. And so, you know, if you asked me previously about some of my milestones, inflection points, and transitions, and I think I've had some pretty big transitions in my career. You know, the common theme is always, you know, sort of operations, meaning like looking at projects or initiatives, which, you know, even running a big company, I think boils down to, you know, sort of initiatives or projects at the end of the day, and leading them. And so I think, you know, in that context, being resilient as I sort of went through these career transitions, they didn't always happen easily. I mentioned to you at CISCO, like I spent a lot of time sort of networking, and I think I did that almost in every case, every time I was at a career transition. And so just sort of writing that out, knowing that, you know, I was interested in this thing that I wanted, which was ultimately to like have a role that pulled all the pieces together to make the, you know, ship run, let's say, or ship not run, I guess, ship, you know, go in the right direction. And so I think that takes, you know, a fair amount of resilience to just sort of hang through it for that. And then the other one I'd say is resourceful. Like I've, sometimes I've had larger teams. Most of the time I've had small teams. And I think, just being able to sort of work with the teams I've given or the resources I've been given to drive change. And I almost think it's easier to almost manage and drive change with smaller teams. But then you have smaller teams, you really have to influence and motivate and inspire them to do big things. And so then I would say that sort of comes down to probably the third key to success, which underlies all of this, is relationships. I think being an engineer and then having gone to business school, I think, sometimes you always want to pay attention to like the hard numbers or the hard facts. And, we all want to be, at least I, always like, oh, I need to be that 8 type personality. And I realized that probably the biggest key to my success has been the ability to build relationships. No matter what personality test I take, the conventional one, which is Myers-Briggs, but there's a whole slew of them out there these days now, which I have taken, a handful of. I always land, like heavily land, where my underlying characteristic or driver is relationships and people. And so when I actually look back, like I'll give you an example. I've actually done an M&A transaction that didn't end up working out, and the numbers were there. I mean, I'd done all the analysis. My team had done the analysis. The justification was absolutely there from a numbers perspective, and it ended up not going through at the end because the relationship of the two companies, it didn't work, and ultimately, like, we decided to not pursue that transaction. So something, as like sort of analytical as an M&A transaction, even those, right, really rely on relationships. And so I would say, at the core of everything I do is building relationships, where I want people to sort of be with me and follow me because they also, are compelled, and not because I've convinced them necessarily to be part of my team.
Neat. Well, I think when you write your first book, you've got the 3 R's, or R cubed, or what have you: resilience, resourcefulness, and relationships. So,
there you go. I didn't even realize that I had that. So thank you for the tagline.
Yeah, it was glaring at me as I was taking notes.
Thank you.
So our audience would certainly like to know, what advice would you give others that seek a COO or a CFO position or career?
Yes, I like how you merged that. I have never heard, I think you asked me that when we were sort of emailing back and forth. I've never heard anyone call it that. Is that something you came up with, or have you seen that?
No, we have another interview on our series landing page, and Dr. Bozen was quick to point out that he has used the term SIFU for a good portion of his career. So
good to
look at that one.
Yeah, I will. That's one I haven't checked out. I think I checked out the more recent one that you had done. But I mean, I would say do it, of course. I love it. But as I think about, if you're interested in this role, like sort of my career path, started out very technical. It doesn't always have to be that. But I think what I did was I took opportunities to learn about every other part of the business through my program management of staff experiences, right? And then combined with management consulting, of course, like when I started at, what I would say was really my first startup, BrightInsight, and as you've noted, there was sort of a wealth of opportunity there for me. I think the foundation really was, for me, built on being comfortable with taking on a lot of different projects in a lot of different areas earlier on in my career, and just, again, sort of being resourceful and resilient to figure out how to get things done. And so I think, part of the advice I would have is, of course, do it, but don't limit yourself to, just the path you're in right now, and take on projects only in those areas. Actually leverage, what you're doing today to, take on, lead projects, and then use that foundation of the skills you learn to learn lead projects, and then use that in other parts of the business, right? Because I think ultimately, as a COO, CFO, either of those roles, separate or combined, I feel like success to those roles is how do the gears turn, right? And I don't mean, again, the traditional operations gears. I think of it more in the context of you have to be able to understand how every part of the company needs to work together, right? So that you're rowing the boat or the ship, my earlier analogy, in the right direction, right? If everyone's sort of rowing in a separate direction, the ship isn't moving. And so I think that that's a big part of it. And then, as you sort of grow in your career, like, and I went through these transitions, at points you're so used to doing the work, but as you sort of take on more and more roles, you have to up level yourself and be able to manage upwards and downwards at the same time. And it's a balancing act, and sort of feel like when you're not in the weeds, building the spreadsheets or designing something or building the project plans directly, that somehow you're not doing the work. And the reality is the more senior you grow in your career, you need to sort of delegate and let other people do those things so that you are spending time really, influencing others to move in that direction, right? So it's more about sort of giving yourself that thinking time, if you will, than always having to just be like doing the work. And then thinking outside the box, I would say, right? I don't have an accounting or finance background directly. I do have an MBA, so I took an accounting class then, and I took finance classes then. CFO is really a strategy role, right? Your CFO, you have a great, controller that's working for you as CPA. You have a great FP&A and like strategic finance team is helping you build all the models. And then, your role as a CFO is really to take those and then help drive the direction of the company through the strategy and then execution, right? And so I think, just sort of keeping in mind that like sometimes you don't have to have gone deep into each area of the business. You just have to understand sort of as a whole how to run the business with the experience that you have.
I agree. Well, Swati, thank you so much. This has been really, really insightful and interesting. And your Rune is a super interesting company. So great success to you and all of our attendees in 2023 and beyond. So thank you again.
Thank you, and I appreciate that you are, pulling these series together. I think I find them quite useful and informative just to see how different people, different leaders in different industries are working through challenges. And so whether we're in the same industry or not, I think there's a lot of commonality into how we run the business. So appreciate you also initiating the series.
All right. Well, thanks again, and look forward to future collaboration. All right. Thank you.
Have a good day.